It all started on a lazy Sunday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling mindlessly on my phone while sipping my first coffee of the day. My gym bag was packed, and I was debating whether to squeeze in a workout before lunch. Everything about the morning felt calm and predictable, until my phone buzzed with a message that shattered my peace. The sender? My younger brother, Jake. The message was brief, almost flippant. "Hey, slight issue." Beneath it was a photo. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at, but then it hit me like a punch to the gut. The crumpled front end of my car stared back at me, wedged against a tree. The windshield shattered. My heart stopped. My first instinct was disbelief. How did he even get my car? The keys were always on a hook in my bedroom, and Jake didn't live with me. I hadn't let anyone else drive it since I bought it, and I certainly hadn't lent it to him. Panic flooded in as I stared at the image, and before I even realized it, my coffee cup slipped out of my hand, spilling across the table. I fumbled with my phone, dialing Jake's number with shaky hands. He picked up after a couple of rings, his voice casual, like this was no big deal. "Hey, yeah, about the car." "What the hell, Jake?" I cut him off, my voice shaking with anger and confusion. "How did you even get my car? And why is it wrapped around a freaking tree?" He sighed, like I was inconveniencing him with my questions. "Chill out, dude. Mom said I could borrow it. I just needed to grab a few things from the store, and, well, some guy cut me off. Not my fault, bro. Not his fault." My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. "Are you kidding me? You took my car without asking, and now it's totaled. Where are you? Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, sounding almost bored. "But, the car's kinda not drivable anymore. Sorry about that." "Sorry? That's all you've got?" My voice was rising, the fury and disbelief too much to contain. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I saved for 3 years to buy that car, Jake. I've been working overtime for months to pay off the loan. You don't just get to borrow it and wreck it without consequences." Okay, chill out. "It's just a car," he said, his tone now edging into irritation. "Why are you blowing this out of proportion? I told you it wasn't my fault." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My hands were gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white.
"Put Mom on the phone," I snapped.
"She's not here," he said, a little too quickly. "But, look, she's the one who said I could take it, so if you want to yell at someone, maybe try her instead of me." I hung up without another word, my head spinning. Anger and disbelief, mixed with a rising sense of dread. My car, my independence, my freedom, my hard-earned reward for years of work, was gone. And the two people who were supposed to have my back had clearly decided this was no big deal. I barely had time to process it before my phone buzzed again, this time with a call from my mom. I took a deep breath, hoping for some explanation, some acknowledgement of how insane this all was. But as soon as I answered, her voice came through calm and composed. "Hey, honey, I just talked to Jake. He told me you're upset. What's going on?" "What's going on?" I repeated, incredulous. "Mom, Jake crashed my car." "My car. He said you told him he could take it. Is that true?" There was a pause, just long enough to set my teeth on edge. "Well, yes," she admitted, "but he only needed it for a quick errand. I didn't think you'd mind." "Didn't think I'd mind?" My voice cracked with frustration. "It's not your car to lend out, Mom. You didn't even ask me. And now it's destroyed." "Calm down," she said, her tone turning defensive. "It's just a car and nobody got hurt. Insurance will take care of it. You're being way too dramatic about this." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It felt like my reality was being flipped upside down. My car wasn't just a car. It was everything I'd worked so hard for, and now it was gone because of them. The phone call ended with Mom insisting I relax, and me fighting the urge to throw my phone against the wall. As I sat there, staring at the wreckage photo Jake had sent me, one thing was clear. This was far from over. Still reeling from my first conversation with Jake, I stared at my phone, debating whether to call my mom again. Part of me hoped there had been some misunderstanding. Maybe Jake had lied or twisted her words. I needed to hear it straight from her. Surely, my mom wouldn't just let him take my car without asking me first. Right? When she picked up, her tone was light, almost casual, like she had no idea of the storm brewing on my end.
"Hi, sweetheart.
What's going on? Did Jake get a hold of you?" I didn't even bother with small talk. "Mom, he crashed my car. He said you told him he could borrow it. Please tell me that's not true." There was a short pause before she replied, her voice calm but defensive. "Oh, honey, calm down. He's your brother. He just needed to grab a few things from the store, and it's not like he meant to crash it. I felt my jaw tighten, and my grip on the phone grew so tight, I thought it might crack. Mom, that's not the point. It's my car. You didn't even ask me. Do you know how much I've worked for that car? How much it means to me? She sighed, the kind of long, drawn-out sigh that parents use when they think their kids are being unreasonable. Stop being so dramatic. Insurance will cover it. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Her dismissive tone hit me like a slap in the face. Are you kidding me? Insurance might not even cover this because Jake wasn't listed on the policy. And even if it does, do you have any idea what kind of hassle this is going to be for me? Do you even care? Oh, don't be ridiculous, she said, her tone still infuriatingly calm. It's just a car. Nobody got hurt, and Jake didn't do it on purpose. These things happen. I could feel my chest tightening, my frustration boiling over. It's not just a car, Mom. It's my car. I worked for 3 years to buy it, and now it's gone because you thought it was okay to hand over my keys without even asking me. Do you know how insane that is? There was another pause, this one longer and more pointed. Finally, she said, I think you're overreacting. Jake feels terrible about this, and he's your brother. Families are supposed to support each other, not hold grudges over accidents. Support each other? I echoed, my voice laced with disbelief. Where was the support for me when you handed my car to Jake without my permission? Where's the support now that I'm left to deal with the fallout? She didn't answer right away, and for a brief moment, I thought I'd gotten through to her. But then she said, Look, I understand you're upset, but this negativity isn't helping anyone. Maybe take a day to cool off, and we'll talk about it later. That was when it hit me. They didn't just feel bad about what had happened. They actually thought I was the unreasonable one. The realization left me stunned, my thoughts spinning. I hung up the phone without saying another word, my chest tight with anger and disbelief. It felt like I was in an alternate reality where the rules of common sense and fairness didn't apply. My mom, the person I'd always thought I could count on, had not only betrayed my trust, but was now brushing it off as if it didn't matter. Over the next hour, I paced around my apartment, replaying the conversation in my head and growing angrier with each pass. I couldn't wrap my head around how she could be so casual about something so serious. This wasn't just a scratch or a dent, it was total destruction. My car was gone, my freedom compromised, and my finances about to take a major hit. As I sat down to gather my thoughts, another realization struck me. If my mom and Jake were so dismissive of what they'd done, what would stop them from doing something like this again? I opened my phone and started looking up the cost of repairing or replacing my car. The numbers made my stomach drop. Even with insurance, if they covered it, I was looking at thousands of dollars in expenses. And that was assuming everything went smoothly, which it rarely did. A text came through while I was in the middle of my search. It was from Jake. Mom said you're freaking out. Chill, bro. It's just a car. Just a car. I stared at the message, the words almost mocking me. This wasn't just a car, it was my hard work, my independence, my ability to go wherever I wanted whenever I wanted. And now, thanks to their carelessness, it was gone. For the first time in my life, I felt completely alienated from my own family. I'd always thought we had each other's backs, that no matter what happened, we'd support each other. But now I realized that support only went one way, from me to them. When I needed them to take responsibility, to acknowledge how badly they'd messed up, they dismissed me instead. I put my phone down, my stomach churning with frustration. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The day after Jake's casual destruction of my car, I decided to see the wreck for myself. It wasn't just curiosity. I needed to know how bad the damage really was, even though I already suspected the answer. I called the tow yard, confirmed the location, and drove over in my friend's car. My stomach churned the entire ride, my mind cycling between anger and dread. When I arrived, the sight of my car confirmed my worst fears. The entire front end was crumpled like an accordion, the hood smashed beyond recognition. The windshield was a spiderweb of cracks, and one of the tires was hanging at an impossible angle. Seeing it in person was somehow worse than the photo Jake had sent. The tow truck driver, a grizzled man in his late 40s, walked up to me, wiping his hands on a rag. "You here for the blue sedan?" he asked. "Yeah," I muttered, my throat tight. He nodded toward the wreckage. "Yikes, this thing's a goner. You're lucky no one got hurt in that." "Yeah, lucky," I said bitterly, staring at the remains of the car I'd worked so hard to own. The driver shook his head sympathetically. You want me to pull it out for you to get a better look, or are you good? No, I'm good, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't stand to look at it any longer than I had to. As I got back into my friend's car, I pulled out my phone and dialed my insurance company, hoping against hope that they'd have some good news. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be the financial disaster I was expecting. But, of course, that wasn't the case. After going through a maze of automated menus and being transferred twice, I finally reached a representative. I explained the situation, trying to keep my voice steady as I described how my brother had crashed my car after taking it without my permission. The rep listened patiently before delivering the blow. Unfortunately, because your brother isn't listed as a covered driver on your policy, the damages aren't covered under your comprehensive or collision coverage. In cases like this, you'd be responsible for the costs out of pocket. Out of pocket? I repeated, my voice rising. Are you serious? He took the car without asking me. This wasn't my fault. I understand your frustration, the rep said, her tone maddeningly calm. But the terms of your policy are clear. I'd recommend discussing this with your family to see if they can contribute toward the repair or replacement costs. I hung up, feeling like the ground had just fallen out from under me. The car was beyond repair, and now I was looking at thousands of dollars to replace it. My savings, already stretched thin, were about to take a catastrophic hit. I drove back to my apartment in a haze, trying to process everything. Once I got home, I decided it was time for a serious conversation with my mom and Jake. They needed to understand how much they'd screwed up, and they needed to take responsibility. When I called Jake, his reaction was infuriatingly flippant. So, what did insurance say? He asked, like this was just another minor inconvenience.
It's not covered, I snapped.
Because you weren't listed on the policy. Do you know what that means, Jake? It means I have to pay for everything out of pocket. Thousands of dollars. All because you took my car without permission. There was a pause before he responded, and when he did, his tone was so casual it made my blood boil. Guess you should have added me, huh? Are you serious right now? I shouted, my anger finally boiling over. This isn't a joke, Jake. Do you have any idea how much money we're talking about here? How much time and effort it's going to take to fix this mess? Chill out, he said, his voice taking on that defensive edge I'd come to despise. I didn't mean for this to happen. It's not like I planned to crash your car. I couldn't even respond. The sheer audacity of his words left me speechless. Instead, I hung up and called my mom, hoping, praying, that she'd take this more seriously. But when I explained the situation to her, her reaction was just as bad. Well, honey, these things happen, she said, her tone maddeningly dismissive. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. I repeated, my voice rising. Mom, this isn't some little problem we can brush under the rug. I'm looking at thousands of dollars in damages because you let Jake take my car without asking me. This is a disaster. Oh, don't be so dramatic, she said, laughing lightly as if I was overreacting. It's just a car. You'll get another one. And Jake feels awful about this. Don't make it harder on him than it already is. I stared at the phone in disbelief, my hands shaking with rage. You can't be serious, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He doesn't feel awful. He doesn't even care. And neither do you. That's not fair, she replied, her voice tinged with annoyance.
I care.
But sitting here yelling at me isn't going to solve anything. We'll figure it out. Just give it some time. I hung up, feeling more alone than ever. It was clear that neither of them truly grasped the severity of what they'd done, or if they did, they just didn't care. As I sat in my apartment, staring at the photo of my wrecked car on my phone, one thing became clear. If I wanted to fix this mess, I was on my own. And the more I thought about it, the angrier I became, not just at them, but at myself for ever thinking I could rely on them in the first place. After several days of stonewalling from Jake and my mom, I knew I needed a new approach. Talking to them one-on-one was getting me nowhere. They either dismissed my frustration or twisted the situation to make me look like the unreasonable one. But Sunday dinner with the extended family was coming up, and I figured that might be my chance. Maybe someone else, someone more level-headed, could step in and make them see how wrong they were. Sunday dinners were a long-standing tradition in our family. My mom loved hosting, and my aunts, uncles, and cousins would gather at her house to catch up over a big meal. I figured that if I brought up the situation in front of everyone, the weight of public opinion might force my mom and Jake to take accountability. I arrived at my mom's house early, the tension in my chest building as I walked in the door. Jake was already there, lounging on the couch and scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. I felt a flash of anger, but forced myself to keep calm. Tonight wasn't about yelling, it was about making them understand. Dinner started off innocently enough. Everyone was chatting about work, school, and the usual family gossip. I kept quiet, waiting for the right moment to bring up the car. As the plates of food were passed around, my mom beamed at everyone, playing the perfect host. It was hard to reconcile this image of her with the dismissive, indifferent person I'd been dealing with all week. Finally, after everyone had settled into their meals, I took a deep breath and said, "So, I've got something I need to talk about, and I could really use some input." All eyes turned to me. My mom froze for a split second, then went back to cutting her chicken like nothing was out of the ordinary. Jake glanced up from his plate, his expression unreadable. "Jake crashed my car last week," I began, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "He took it without asking, and now it's totaled. The insurance isn't covering it because he wasn't on the policy, and I'm stuck dealing with the fallout." There was a brief silence before my aunt chimed in. "Oh my gosh, are you okay, Jake? Were you hurt?" Jake shrugged, flashing a sheepish smile. "Nah, I'm fine. It wasn't that bad of a crash. The car just took the brunt of it." I clenched my fists under the table. "That's not the point. The point is that he shouldn't have been driving my car in the first place. And now I'm left with no car and a massive bill, and neither of them seemed to care." My mom set down her fork and sighed dramatically. "Honey, we've already talked about this. Jake didn't mean to crash the car, and nobody got hurt. You're making this into a much bigger deal than it needs to be." I could feel the heat rising in my face, but before I could respond, my uncle spoke up. "He's just a kid," he said, shaking his head. "Accidents happen. You shouldn't hold this over his head like he committed a crime." "He's 23, I snapped. "He's not a kid. He's an adult who made a reckless decision, and now I'm the one paying for it. Literally." My cousin chimed in next, trying to play peacemaker. "I get that you're upset, but it's just a car. You'll get another one eventually. Don't let this ruin your relationship with Jake or Aunt Linda." "Just a car?" The words hit me like a slap. It's not just a car. It's my independence, my hard work, my future plans. I spent years saving for that car, and now it's gone because of their thoughtlessness. This isn't about the car, it's about the principle. My mom leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "We all make mistakes," she said, her tone bordering on condescending. "You're acting like this is some catastrophic event. You'll move on and things will get better. You just have to let it go. Let it go." I looked around the table, searching for anyone who might back me up, but most of my family avoided my gaze. It was clear they didn't want to get involved, or worse, they agreed with my mom. That's when it hit me. They didn't want to understand. They didn't want to acknowledge how much this had cost me, financially, emotionally, or otherwise, because doing so would mean admitting that they were wrong. It was easier for them to minimize my pain than to confront their own mistakes. I set my fork down, my appetite gone. "You're right," I said, my voice cold. "I'll move on. But don't expect me to just forget about this or pretend like it didn't happen. Actions have consequences, and if you can't take responsibility for what you've done, that's on you." The rest of dinner passed in awkward silence. My mom and Jake avoided eye contact with me, and the rest of the family made strained attempts at small talk to fill the tension. When the meal was over, I left without saying goodbye. As I drove home, I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. Angry that they still didn't get it, but relieved that I'd finally said my piece. I realized then that I couldn't rely on them to fix this. They weren't going to change, no matter how much I wanted them to. If I was going to move forward, I'd have to do it on my own terms. After the debacle at Sunday dinner, I decided I needed space to think, space to breathe, and most importantly, space away from Jake and my mom. Every interaction with them left me more frustrated and exhausted, like I was shouting into a void. So I did the only thing I could think of. I stopped responding. Their texts started coming in the next day. Jake's messages ranged from half-hearted apologies to defensive jabs. "Sorry again about the car. Didn't mean for it to happen. Why aren't you answering? Are you seriously this mad? It was an accident, bro. Mom says you're being petty. You're gonna ruin Thanksgiving over this?" I didn't respond to any of them. I deleted most of his voicemails without listening, though a few slipped through before I could swipe them away. His voice alternated between whiny and accusatory, like he couldn't decide whether he wanted to make amends or make me feel bad. One message stuck in my mind. "Look, I said I was sorry. What else do you want? You're acting like I murdered someone. It's just a car. Grow up." I wanted to scream every time I thought about those words. Just a car. For them, maybe it was. But for me, It represented years of hard work and sacrifices. Every weekend shift, every overtime hour, it all led to that car. And now it was gone just like that because Jake and my mom had treated it like a toy. For a week, I ignored their attempts to contact me. I went to work, came home, and tried to distract myself with movies, books, and long walks around the neighborhood. But no matter what I did, the anger and frustration simmered just beneath the surface. Then one evening there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I peered through the peephole, hoping it was a package delivery. Instead, I saw my mom standing there holding a casserole dish like this was some kind of casual visit. I debated not answering, but she knocked again, louder this time. "I know you're in there," she called. Reluctantly, I opened the door. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my tone flat. She gave me a wide, overly cheerful smile. "I thought I'd bring you dinner. You've been so busy, and I figured you could use a home-cooked meal." I stared at her, unimpressed. "What do you really want, Mom?" Her smile faltered, and she stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. She set the casserole dish on my counter and turned to face me, her hands on her hips. "This isn't like you," she said, her voice full of forced concern. "You're usually so easygoing. Why are you letting this bother you so much?" My jaw tightened. "Why am I letting this bother me? Are you serious? You and Jake destroyed my car, Mom, and you've done nothing but brush it off like it's no big deal. How am I supposed to feel?" She frowned, her brow creasing as if she couldn't understand my anger. "Honey, I said I was sorry. Jake said he was sorry. What more do you want? You're making this so much bigger than it needs to be." "I want accountability," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I want you to understand how much this has cost me, not just financially but emotionally. And I want you to stop acting like I'm the problem here." She took a deep breath, her eyes starting to glisten. "I didn't come here to fight," she said, her voice trembling. "I came here because I miss you. This silence, this isn't how our family works. We've always been close, and I don't understand why you're pushing us away." Her tears started to fall then, soft and quiet at first, and I felt the smallest twinge of guilt. This was my mom, the woman who'd raised me, who'd always been there for me in the past. But even as part of me wanted to comfort her, another part of me stayed firm. "Mom," I said, my voice gentler now, "if the roles were reversed, if I'd taken something of yours and destroyed it, would you just let it go? Would you laugh it off and tell yourself it's no big deal?" Her tears stopped almost immediately. She looked at me, her face blank, as if she hadn't considered the question before. Her silence was all the answer I needed. I nodded, taking a step back. "That's what I thought. I love you, Mom. But I can't keep pretending this doesn't matter to me. It matters. And until you and Jake can take responsibility for what you've done, I need some space." She left a few minutes later, the casserole still sitting untouched on my counter. As the door closed behind her, I felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness, anger, and a hint of relief. For the first time, I felt like I'd truly stood up for myself, even if it came at the cost of temporary distance from my family. The silent treatment continued after that. Jake's messages slowed down, and my mom didn't call again. The quiet was both a blessing and a curse. It gave me time to process everything, but it also made me realize how deeply this rift had cut into our family. Still, I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. Not yet, anyway. I needed them to understand that actions have consequences, and that I wouldn't let them sweep this under the rug. Whether they ever truly got it was another question entirely. Weeks passed, and the tension between me, my mom, and Jake only deepened. At first, I'd expected time to bring some clarity, for them to reflect on what had happened and reach out with genuine apologies. But instead, their approach was the opposite. Pretend like nothing had happened and act as if I was the one causing the problem by refusing to let it go. Jake, in particular, seemed determined to act like we were best friends again. He started sending me memes and videos on social media, the kind of harmless content he'd always spammed me with before the car incident. "This one's hilarious, you've got to see it," he'd write, as if I hadn't ignored the last dozen messages he'd sent. One evening, he called me out of the blue, and against my better judgment, I picked up. "Yo, what's up?" he asked, his voice as casual as ever. "What do you want, Jake?" I said, my tone flat. "Chill, man," he replied. "I just thought we could hang out. Grab a beer or something. It's been weeks. Don't you think it's time to let this go? Let it go." I repeated, incredulous. "You wrecked my car, Jake. You and Mom have done nothing but minimize it and blame me for being upset. Why would I want to hang out with you? He sighed heavily, like I was the unreasonable one. Dude, I said I was sorry. What more do you want? You're acting like I totaled your house or something. It's just a car. And there it was again, just a car. My patience snapped. You know what, Jake? Until you figure out what you actually did wrong and how much this has cost me, not just in money but in trust, don't bother calling me again. I hung up before he could respond, my hands trembling with a mix of anger and frustration. As much as I wanted to believe Jake could change, it was clear he wasn't ready to take responsibility. My mom, meanwhile, had shifted from passive dismissal to outright guilt-tripping. Every few days, she'd call or text with some variation of the same message. This family isn't the same without you. One evening, she finally broke her pattern and left a voicemail that was less about guilt and more about confrontation. I've had enough of this, she said, her voice sharp. You're tearing this family apart, and for what? A car? Jake is your brother, and I'm your mother. If you can't forgive us, then maybe you need to think about what kind of person you're becoming. When I called her back, she didn't waste time on pleasantries. This has gone on long enough, she said as soon as she answered. Either you forgive your brother, or we're done as a family. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. What? I asked, stunned. You're really willing to cut ties with me over this? Over his mistake. I'm not cutting ties, she said defensively. You are. You're the one refusing to move on. Families are supposed to stick together, but you've made it impossible. I've tried to be patient, but this has to stop. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. Mom, I'm not the one who needs to make amends here. Jake took my car without asking, wrecked it, and hasn't done a single thing to make it right. And you enabled him and dismissed my feelings every step of the way. You both need to take responsibility. Until then, I'm not playing along. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought she might actually hear me, might finally understand where I was coming from. But when she spoke again, her voice was cold. I don't know what's happened to you, she said. This isn't who you are. Maybe this is who I've always been, I replied quietly. And maybe you're just seeing it now because I'm not rolling over like I usually do. She hung up without another word. I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone, wondering if that was the last conversation I'd ever have with her. The idea left a hollow ache in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to regret what I'd said. For too long, I'd let my family take advantage of my easygoing nature, assuming I'd always forgive and forget no matter how much they hurt me. This time, I couldn't let it slide. The days that followed were eerily quiet. No texts, no calls, no guilt-laden voicemails. The silence was both a relief and a source of anxiety. I didn't know if this was the calm before the storm, or if they'd truly decided to cut me out. For the first time in my life, I felt completely adrift. My family had always been my anchor, the one constant I could rely on even when everything else fell apart. Now, that anchor was gone, and I wasn't sure if I could, or should, get it back. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. Whether or not they came around, I had to move forward. I couldn't let their refusal to take responsibility define my life. If they were willing to throw away our relationship over this, then maybe it was time for me to start building something new, something that didn't rely on their approval. That thought gave me a strange sense of peace, even as I drifted into an uneasy sleep. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was taking control of my own story. A few days after my mom's ultimatum, I got a call from my dad. He's always been the quieter, more hands-off parent, the kind of guy who avoids conflict and keeps his opinions to himself. So when I saw his name on my phone, I hesitated. Part of me assumed he was calling to defend my mom and Jake, or to guilt-trip me into forgiving them. But curiosity won out, and I answered. Hey, he said, his voice as calm as ever. I've been hearing about what's going on with the car and your brother. Yeah, I replied cautiously. What about it? Well, he began, I think we should talk. Just you and me. Can we grab a coffee or something? His tone didn't carry any judgment, just a quiet sincerity that caught me off guard. I wasn't sure what to expect, but something told me I should hear him out. Okay, I said. When? We agreed to meet the next afternoon at a small cafe near my apartment. I showed up early, nervously nursing a cup of coffee while I waited. My dad arrived a few minutes later, dressed in his usual jeans and a flannel shirt, and gave me a nod as he slid into the seat across from me. Thanks for meeting me, he said, taking a sip of the coffee he'd grabbed on his way in. No problem, I replied, trying to read his expression. He looked calm but thoughtful, like he was carefully considering his words. So, he began, leaning forward slightly, I've been talking to your mom. She's pretty upset about all this. Here we go, I thought. I braced myself for the lecture. The guilt trip, the pressure to just be the bigger person.
But then he surprised me.
And honestly, he said, I think you're right to be upset. I blinked, caught off guard. Wait, what? He gave a small shrug. Jake was careless, and your mom shouldn't have let him take the car without your permission. They put you in a bad spot, and instead of owning up to it, they've been trying to sweep it under the rug. That's not okay. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt a flicker of relief. Someone understood. Someone in my family actually saw things from my perspective. Thank you, I said, my voice almost shaking. You have no idea how much it means to hear that. He nodded, his expression serious. I know it's been hard for you, and you're not wrong to feel the way you do.
But
there it was. The inevitable but. I braced myself again, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But holding on to this isn't going to fix your car or your relationship with them, he said gently. What do you really want out of this? The question hung in the air between us. What did I want? Justice? An apology? Financial restitution? Part of me wanted them to suffer as much as I had, but I knew that wasn't realistic or healthy. I don't know, I admitted after a long pause. I want them to take responsibility. I want them to understand how much this has hurt me. That's fair, my dad said. But you need to think about what that looks like. What would make you feel like they've made amends? And what are you willing to do if they don't? His words hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so much time being angry, justifiably so, that I hadn't stopped to think about what resolution actually looked like. I sipped my coffee, staring at the table as I tried to form an answer. I guess I just want them to acknowledge what they did, I said finally. To admit they were wrong and actually try to make things right. And if they can't do that, I shrugged, my voice trailing off. I don't know if I can keep pretending everything's okay. My dad nodded thoughtfully. That's a tough spot to be in. But whatever you decide, you need to be clear about what you want. Set boundaries and stick to them. You've got every right to protect yourself. We sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the cafe buzzing around us. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't alone in this. My dad might not have had all the answers, but his support meant more than I could put into words. Before we parted ways, he reached across the table and gave my hand a firm squeeze.
I'm proud of you, he said.
Standing up for yourself isn't easy, especially when it's family.
Just don't let this eat you up inside, okay?
You've got a good heart. Don't lose that. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. Thanks, Dad. As I walked back to my apartment, his words echoed in my mind. What do you really want out of this? It was a question I didn't have an answer to yet, but for the first time, I felt like I was heading in the right direction. After my conversation with my dad, I couldn't stop thinking about his advice. What do you really want out of this? The question had been circling in my head like a mantra, forcing me to confront the messy reality of the situation. I knew I didn't want to stay locked in this cycle of anger and avoidance forever. But I also couldn't just let things slide without some kind of resolution. So I decided to call a family meeting. It wasn't an easy decision. The idea of sitting down with my mom and Jake after weeks of silence made my stomach churn, but if there was even a chance to mend things, I had to try. I texted both of them, keeping the message short and neutral. We need to talk. Can we meet at Mom's place tomorrow evening? It's important. To my surprise, they both agreed without argument. The next evening, I drove to my mom's house, my nerves on edge the entire way. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say a dozen times, but the thought of actually saying it out loud made my palms sweat. When I arrived, Jake was already there, slouched on the couch with his phone in hand. My mom was bustling around the kitchen, her movements unusually brisk. The tension in the air was palpable. Let's just sit down and get this over with, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We gathered in the living room, the three of us sitting in a loose triangle. Jake looked awkward, like he wanted to be anywhere else. My mom sat stiffly, her arms crossed, already defensive. I took a deep breath. I'm not here to fight, I began, forcing myself to keep my tone calm. But we need to talk about what happened with the car. I need you both to understand why this hurt me so much. Jake rolled his eyes slightly, but didn't say anything. My mom just gave a small, tight nod, as if granting me permission to continue. I worked hard for that car, I said, my voice steady but firm. I spent years saving for it, taking extra shifts, cutting corners wherever I could. When I finally bought it, it wasn't just a car to me. It was a symbol of my independence and everything I'd worked for. And then, in one day, it was gone. Jake looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from irritation to something more serious. But it wasn't just the car, I continued. It was the way you both handled it. Jake, you took the car without asking. And Mom, you gave him permission to do it, even though you knew it wasn't yours to lend out. Then, when everything went wrong, neither of you took responsibility. Instead, you acted like I was the one overreacting, like my feelings didn't matter. That's what hurt the most. There was a long silence after I finished speaking. Jake stared at the floor, his usual smirk replaced by a look of genuine discomfort. My mom fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, avoiding my gaze. Finally, Jake broke the silence. I didn't think about it like that, he said quietly. I needed to run an errand, and I figured it wouldn't be a big deal. I didn't mean to wreck your car, and I guess I thought saying sorry was enough. But I get it now.
I'm sorry.
I'll pay you back, somehow. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. It was the first time he'd shown real remorse, and for a moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. Thank you, I said, nodding. I appreciate that. I turned to my mom, who was still sitting stiffly. Mom? I prompted gently. She sighed heavily, her face pinched with discomfort. Look, I made a mistake, she said reluctantly. I shouldn't have let Jake take the car without asking you. But we all make mistakes. I didn't mean to hurt you, and I think you're blowing this out of proportion. Life happens. You just have to move on. Her words felt like a slap, but I forced myself to stay calm. I'm not trying to hold a grudge, Mom, I said. But moving on doesn't mean pretending this didn't happen. It means acknowledging what went wrong and making sure it doesn't happen again. She pursed her lips, but didn't argue further. It wasn't the apology I'd been hoping for, but at least it was something. The rest of the meeting was a mix of awkward silences and tentative agreements. Jake promised to start paying me back in small installments, and my mom said she'd help however she could, though her tone made it clear she still thought I was being too harsh. When I left that night, I felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, it wasn't the perfect resolution I'd been hoping for. My mom's half-hearted apology still stung, and I knew it would take time to rebuild my trust in both of them. But on the other hand, it felt like a start. As I drove home, my dad's words echoed in my mind. What do you really want out of this? I realized that what I wanted wasn't perfection, it was progress. And for the first time in weeks, it felt like we were heading in the right direction. After the tense family meeting, the atmosphere between me, Jake, and my mom shifted. It wasn't a dramatic change. There were no grand gestures or tearful reconciliations, but it was enough to feel like the ice had started to thaw. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was completely alone in dealing with the fallout. True to his word, Jake began sending me small payments every couple of weeks. They weren't huge amounts, $20 here, $30 there, but each transfer came with a note for the car. Sorry again. At first, I wasn't sure if it was enough to make up for everything, but over time, I began to appreciate the effort. Jake wasn't one to take responsibility easily, so even these small steps felt significant. My mom, on the other hand, kept her distance. She didn't call or text as often as she used to, and when she did, her messages were short and to the point. At first, her silence felt like a punishment, a way of making me feel guilty for standing my ground. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to see it differently. Maybe she was grappling with her own guilt or simply didn't know how to bridge the gap between us. It hurt, of course. I'd always been close to my mom, and her absence left a noticeable void in my life. But instead of dwelling on it, I decided to focus on the progress we were making, however small it might be. One of the first steps I took was dealing with the wreckage of my car. Seeing it sit in the tow yard, a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong, was unbearable. So I made a few calls, got quotes from local salvage yards, and finally sold it for scrap. The amount I received was laughable compared to what I'd paid for the car, but it was something. With that money in hand, I began the search for a replacement. I scoured online listings, visited used car dealerships, and even test drove a few beat-up sedans that made me miss my old car even more. Eventually, I found a used car within my budget, not my dream car, but reliable enough to get me back on the road. Signing the paperwork and driving it home felt like a small victory, a step toward regaining the independence I'd lost. As I adjusted to life with my new, to me, car, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The anger and frustration I'd carried for weeks began to fade, replaced by a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about the car anymore, it was about so much more. The whole ordeal had forced me to confront some hard truths about my family and myself. I'd always been the easygoing one, the one who went along with things to keep the peace. But this time I hadn't. I'd stood my ground, set boundaries, and demanded accountability, even when it meant risking relationships that meant the world to me. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without cost. My relationship with my mom was still strained, and while Jake's payments were a step in the right direction, we hadn't yet returned to the easy camaraderie we once shared. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was living on my own terms, not bending to everyone else's expectations. There were moments of doubt, of course. Late at night, I'd find myself wondering if I'd done the right thing. Should I have let it go sooner? Could I have handled it differently? But then I'd think about my dad's advice. What do you really want out of this? What I wanted was to feel respected, valued, and heard. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was on the path to achieving that, not just with my family, but with myself. Life didn't magically return to normal. There were still awkward silences at family gatherings, still moments when I missed the closeness I'd once shared with my mom and Jake. But there were also glimmers of hope. Jake texted me more often, not just to send payments, but to share updates about his life. My mom called one evening to check on me, her voice hesitant but warm. Bit by bit, the pieces of our relationships began to shift and settle into something new. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real, and for that I was grateful. Looking back, I realized that the whole ordeal had taught me something invaluable, the importance of boundaries and the strength it takes to enforce them. It wasn't just about the car, it was about reclaiming my voice and standing up for what mattered to me. And in the end, that was worth more than anything money could buy. Months passed, and life slowly returned to something resembling normalcy. My new car wasn't flashy or particularly exciting, but it got me where I needed to go. Jake's payments trickled in consistently, and while they didn't erase what had happened, they showed that he was making an effort. My relationship with my mom remained strained but cordial. We spoke occasionally, though our conversations were careful, avoiding anything that might reignite old tensions. Then, one afternoon, my phone buzzed with a call from Jake. His name flashing on the screen still triggered a twinge of anxiety, but I answered, curious about what he might want. "Hey," he said, sounding surprisingly upbeat. "Got a minute?" "Sure," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "So, I got a job," he said, a note of pride creeping into his voice. "It's nothing fancy, just working at a warehouse, but the pay's decent. And I was thinking, I want to pay back the rest of the money I owe for the car. All at once." His words caught me off guard. For months, I'd assumed the small payments would continue indefinitely or, worse, taper off entirely as he forgot or lost interest. The idea that he wanted to settle the debt in one go felt almost surreal. "Wow," I said, after a moment of stunned silence. That's great, Jake. Are you sure? I mean, I don't want you to stretch yourself too thin." "I'm sure," he said firmly. "I screwed up, and I've been thinking a lot about what you said. You were right. I didn't take it seriously at first, but I want to make it right. So, yeah, I'm sure." For the first time in months, I felt a genuine sense of closure. Jake had matured in ways I hadn't expected, and hearing him take responsibility without prompting felt like a victory, not just for me, but for him as well. True to his word, the money landed in my account a few days later, accompanied by a short message. "Hope this helps make up for everything. Sorry again." It wasn't just the money that mattered. It was the fact that he'd followed through, proving that he'd learned something from the whole ordeal. As for my mom, her apology came in a more roundabout way. It was a Sunday afternoon when she called, her voice unusually soft. "Hey, sweetie," she said. "I just wanted to check in. How are you doing?" "I'm good," I replied cautiously. "How about you?" "Oh, same old," she said with a small laugh. There was a pause before she added, "I've been thinking about everything that happened with the car and with us." My chest tightened slightly, but I stayed quiet, letting her continue. "I still think you could have handled it differently," she admitted, her tone hesitant. "But I could have handled it differently, too. I wasn't as supportive as I should have been, and I'm sorry for that. I didn't mean to make you feel like your feelings didn't matter." It wasn't the perfect apology I'd imagined, but it was more than I'd expected. "Thanks, Mom," I said, my voice soft. "That means a lot." For the first time in months, I felt like we were on the same page, or at least closer to it. Our conversation shifted to lighter topics, and while there was still a lingering awkwardness, it felt like a step forward. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that the whole ordeal had been a turning point, not just in my relationships with Jake and my mom, but in my understanding of myself. I'd always been the easygoing one in the family, the one who avoided conflict and smoothed over rough edges to keep the peace. But standing up for myself, even when it meant being labeled difficult, had shown me the power of setting boundaries and sticking to them. The experience had taught me that sometimes being the difficult one is necessary. It means valuing yourself enough to demand respect, even from the people you love most. And while it wasn't easy, it was worth it. My relationships with Jake and my mom weren't perfect, but they were evolving. We were learning, slowly but surely, how to navigate this new dynamic, one built on mutual respect and accountability. As I hung up the phone with my mom that day, I felt a strange sense of peace. The road had been rocky, but we'd come out the other side stronger. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be.